come at the instigation of Roy Kreitner, who invited me to take part in this afternoon's panel. I thank you for the opportunity. These are remarks that are no less inspired by Roy and the sensibility that informed the thoughts he offered us yesterday in his paper and his remarks on concepts, context, and contests. So I want to try today to expand briefly, or at least historicize, and I like to think that those are largely synonymous actions, on yesterday's insights regarding the epistemological essence of economy and of our own view of economy. And I want to do that first by offering an anecdote about my own epistemological awakening, so to speak. And that occurred, or my own initial recognition that capitalism is first and foremost an episteme, a condition, I think, which also finds explicit expression in capital's great transformation into an ism. The transformation, that is, of a heretofore marginal form of property into a general scheme for all of social life. Capitalism. So my first inkling of this new order of things came when I began research on a dissertation devoted to the invention of ready-made clothing in America. An inquiry which I conceived as a materialist history of modernity. That's rather bombastic, but so be it. Anyway, I noticed something right away was amiss in my own conceptual apparatus when I sought to establish the material parameters of my project. But I couldn't find any empirical evidence. That is, there were no numbers. There was no lack of contemporary testimony regarding the appearance of a vast new industry busily and profitably clothing about 15 million American men in a cut-rate, three-piece geometry of planes and angles. On the other hand, the formal record of the nation's manufacturing activity was completely blank. In official terms, the early industrial economy in America recognized no such enterprise. That very discrepancy became, in fact, the starting point of my education, for my education, in the foibles and follies of political economy. So the informational lacuna was eventually filled in 1850, when clothing ultimately, suddenly, showed up en masse in the official version of economic life. That happened. Why did that happen? It happened when the federal census adopted a new taxonomy for counting industrial production. And this was done with a single instruction to census marshals, directing them to list, and I quote, every corporation, company, or individual producing articles to the annual value of $500. The new monetized threshold returned a vastly more extensive, vastly more variegated account of the nation's economy than had ever previously been generated. In unshackled knowledge of industry from older moral economies and artisanal visions of the Commonwealth, which had identified a priori those branches of production that were deemed essential to the development of the nation's economy and society. Then details concerning their respective operations were collected, which is why whole sections of the real economy, for my purposes, the production of clothing, were left completely out of the record. It was the making of cloth, not of clothing, which constituted the focus of humanity's productive efforts, as it has since more or less the dawn of civilization, if not, in fact, having defined what civilization was. Cutting the resulting fabrics up into pieces to then be sewn back together according to this or that pattern was a modest elaboration at best of the original productive effort and the original productive value. So the enumeration of 1850 actually inverted that traditional, well-established version of economy. Now the details of any enterprise producing articles to the annual value of $500 would be collected first without determining their place or their rank in the grand scheme of things. Only after the raw figures were aggregated and correlated would they then be extracted into pertinent hierarchies of capital investment, rate of return, productive volume, or the numbers of those employed, that is, paid a wage, in making up the goods. This resulted in an unprecedented pluralism. Shirt-bosomed subcontractors in southern Manhattan sharing for the first time the same economic universe as textile magnates in Lowell, coal mine owners in Lehigh, a universe that was now constituted of the money value of everyone's respective product. That inclusive picture provided incontrovertible proof that the economic statistics were exactly what they claimed to be, a neutral site of knowledge based on axioms of universality. This was not just an economic scheme. This program of individualizing in order to universalize. The same inclusive taxonomy was also applied in 1850 to the census's population schedule, which thus turned the population schedule as well into a ledger of the nation, in the unhappy but oh so precise metaphor employed by the superintendent of that year's census. This meant that all queries were posed for the first time to all persons, who were also each identified for the first time by name and accorded their own discrete field in the census blanks. Census blanks, by the way, I think is the greatest misnomer in the history of knowledge. Individuals thus replaced households as the basis of what we know about society, exactly in the same years that the individual also emerged as an ism, as an individualism. The new social knowledge embraced an unprecedented range of relations between fathers and mothers, sons, daughters, lodgers, boarders, laborers, domestics, and servants, excluding slaves, however, who were assigned their own separate but far less personalized schedule in the census. Everyone and everyone could now all be combined and compared for the first time, including their age and their sex, years of schooling, property holdings, marital status, occupation, place of birth. It was an extraordinarily ambitious and extraordinarily successful project, critical, I would argue, in establishing what proved to be the shared foundation of both liberal democracy and market economy, and that is relative value. So one last look at the manufacturing schedule shows how intertwined democracy and the market economy now became. For not only did the census forms resemble the business ledger's own rows and columns of inputs and outputs, but the commodity form itself was assigned epistemological status, resulting in an economy that worked only for profit. And that was because every corporation, company, or individual producing articles to the annual value of $500, the key of universal inclusion, clearly only did so with the intention that such an amount would exceed expenses. This meant that the mixing of labor with nature would not be counted as an industrial activity by the newly exhaustive, inclusive statistics unless the resulting products circulated as goods for sale. Truck and barter of a distinctly monetized variety now emerged as the source of both commonwealth and common sense. Do I have a few more minutes?
Roy's doing it.
I want to talk about standard of living. You're my best friend. So I want to talk about the standard of living, which I think is a related event, which occurs in these same years. It's a remarkable new turn of phrase, and I think arguably, at least the most pithy expression I know of industrial revolution. I have never examined in any rigorous fashion the etymology of this phrase, but we can find, I think, an early version of the standard of living in a draft proposal submitted to Congress in 1836. It contained a precis for a survey of the welfare of the species, or alternatively, the population's standards of comfort. These measures would be derived by comparing the costs of subsistence, which were political economy's trinity of food, clothing, and rent. But the plan gave equal, on one hand, the initiative clearly was motivated by a rising concern with industrial age poverty. But the plan also gave expression to an industrial age commitment to prosperity. Welfare and comfort, that is to say, was no longer the exclusive prerogative of the property classes, but it was a universal value, relevant to the public as a whole. If the survey's returns revealed a chronic condition of want, then reforms in the organization of government, let alone the distribution of society's wealth, would clearly need to be carried out. The concern for the welfare of the species was now codified in this conceptual neologism, standard of living, which was unthinkable and was also uncalculable in a household economy. It used cash inscriptions of each person's situation to determine whether the economy was supplying the general welfare. The value of money was translated into an ethical category, a proto-Pareto gauge of not just social utility, but in fact social justice. And so working men's movements began to calculate the routine expenses incurred by a family residing in the city, subtracting the resulting sum from the average weekly wage in order to prove just how little was left over for ice cream or for a trip up the river in order to get some fresh air. Their employers embraced the same logic. They constructed personal budgets based on extant wage information in order to reach the opposite conclusion and demonstrate the improved condition of labor in the age of capital. In either case, and regardless of whose numbers proved to be more reliable, a family competence was annexed to commercial arithmetic, reconceived in terms of relative purchasing power. Membership in the community became a function of cash on hand, apprehended in an accounting vernacular wholly dispassionate, wholly autonomous, whose enumerations replaced rhetoric and allegory as the grammar of public happiness and of politics altogether. Henry Carey, who was America's best known, a highly reputed economist at mid-century, was even inspired to claim that such price-driven metrics made it possible to talk about equality in practical terms for the first time. And that was because these numerators were an indisputably objective form of knowledge, equally valuable, or equally valid, I should say, for one and all. So, in the standard of living, turned our subjective needs into general values, suggesting that, in fact, the increasingly popular use of such a commercial lexicon in speaking about oneself, referring to time profitably spent, or referring to an investment in one's character, or more generally, an accounting for oneself. All these weren't metaphors. This was a direct expression of the market's new role in the production of meaning, personal meaning. Society was embedded in the economy, which meant that personal lives were increasingly defined as a function of a continuously updated grid of costs and benefits that turned everyone into the subject of accounts residing in a benthamite universe of calculable pains and pleasures that offered a significantly more reliable calculus, especially when compared to traditional primitive motives of behavior as fame and glory, a reliable calculus for making our ever-expanding range of personal choices. The money motive was far better suited to modern social life than the honorary motive proponents of the market exerted at the time, since the former, the money motive, was a universal value, giving to all persons the same impulse for activity. Questions of honor remain the purchase of a comparatively small proportion of any community, and I'm quoting the contemporaries. Cash, once again, provided the most effective means for recollectivizing the Commonwealth, that is, for giving birth to a modern commercial community. So the groundwork was laid for an even more perverse market-inspired idiom, in what can be identified, I think, as the defining slogan of our own times: human capital. And for the unbearable, because almost unconscious casualness by which the logics, by which it indicates how the logics of capital have seeped into our thought. Now I'm quoting Rui from yesterday. Seeped into our thought. However, I want to differ. I think it's more like a flood.